Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
This may be helpful. That's the origin. The wolf means it may be helpful.
Really?
In Dutch, the word is to you.
Already, please.
Like
It's
usually.
from Latin, and the origin is it may be helpful.
And then Laheim
How's it spelled?
for life.
It's spelled the same way.
Life.
I don't know. That's what the German guys told me when I was.
Salute is like
You should never trust a
yeah.
Where? Or after they were
It's German.
Yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
And you know why
You can check it.
I didn't even
You know what you
click.
You know what you do.
Yeah.
I was just making sure that we all
It's a nice whiskey.
Okay, that's
Nice,
nice.
yeah, whiskey.
Not much.
Third session. Oh, do I need to bring the yellow one?
No, I'm looking at you.
You wanted to throw it in?
Play during. We're gonna add another level to the introduction later on. This round doesn't need an introduction.
Apparently not.
We've lost the anthropologist though.
But this is too much for me.
Too many
Well,
lies.
it's still from position for human rights.
We need
It's
round.
too weird of a culture to investigate.
He ran away.
His predecessor,
Tomorrow.
Ran from the ICRC.
No,
You know that he used to be the.
I know Ran.
Okay.
Can I have just a small comment? A petition, actually. I love that we are so passionate, etc. But for example, for me, the previous session, there were so many people talking about detailed concepts that, for example, I didn't really know about, and you were cutting in the middle of the phrase.
Exactly. So that's the idea.
And
of
the
this
physician
workshop.
probably.
That was actually intention.
Could we maybe turn on the AC? As a point of, yeah.
So we're having another session. As you saw in the previous session, discussion can be a bit passionate on the live side, and we love it. But we have to remember that the end point of the workshop is to promote the discussion and the draft into an actual published paper. And although we are always happy to tell Bohrer that he's wrong, we often get the chance to do so.
And if he hit me, that would have been unintended. Just saying.
Yeah.
Still very responsible.
As a state.
We are not. Not gonna waste any more of Diletta's time. We're gonna let Diletta, because we're doing we're recording that, it would be we don't need to run introduction. I think a short introduction of yourself and then starting to talk. That way, the edited version of that is begin now.
We are serious people.
We are serious people. We are passionate and we care about our field. And we are now with our journey. So about 30 minutes.
Yeah.
You are.
So hello everyone. As you may know by now, my name is Diletta Marchesi. I'm based in Belgium at Leuven, where I'm doing a PhD in ICL on something completely different from what I'm presenting today in a kamikaze movement. Today we'll talk a little bit about disinformation and how to regulate disinformation under international humanitarian law. So let's start. Maybe.
Right.
It's not working.
I think the clicker needs.
1 second.
Well, we will deal with the issue, especially under the lenses of the war against Ukraine. Just to give you a little bit of a background, so something actually. Who hasn't heard that the invasion of Ukraine is justified because Ukrainians are committing genocide against Russian speakers in the East? Who hasn't seen the deepfake of President Zelensky praying the Ukrainians to lay down their arms and surrender to Russia? And who hasn't read that the ICRC is deporting Ukrainians into Russia? Well, during this war, the war against Ukraine, we have been literally bombarded by fake news, by misinformation and disinformation, especially of any sort. And in fact, we can count more than 5,800 cases of Russian disinformation targeting Ukraine since 2014. And these are the statistics published by EU versus Disinfo, which is a flagship project of the European Union and the external action of the European Union. So we can see from these statistics that actually disinformation has become truly a crucial method of warfare, and it will play an even more preponderant role, I believe, in the warfare of tomorrow, with what I think are potentially disastrous effects for both combatants and non-combatants as the technology advances. So the question I would like to tackle today is the following. Is the current international humanitarian law framework sufficient in tackling disinformation in armed conflict? And I will deal with this issue in three different sections of this presentation. So first of all, we will deal a little bit with the definition of disinformation. And then we will analyze how IHL currently regulates or not disinformation. And then I will finish with a sort of a call to action to regulate disinformation under IHL. So what is disinformation? Of course, there are many different definitions out there. I really like the definition provided by the EU Commission, which says that the disinformation is all forms of false, inaccurate, or misleading information designed, presented, and promoted to intentionally cause public harm or for profit. And what distinguishes, on a terminological point of view, disinformation from misinformation is actually this intentionality, the fact that it's something that is done deliberately, okay? Of course, there are different types of disinformation out there. They can present misleading, imposter, manipulated, fabricated content, or contain false context, connection, etc. But yeah, what is really important is, again, this deliberate intention to mislead them. We all know that disinformation is today a very pervasive phenomenon in all aspects of our society, actually. And it has been considered one of the most serious threats today to peace, democracy, and global stability. So disinformation in armed conflicts, as we have seen already with the war against Ukraine, is really becoming something widespread. And in fact, armed conflicts have been considered already by the scholarship as fertile incubators for different reasons. For example, it's particularly difficult to regulate, to do counter-regulation during armed conflicts, and also it's a fertile ground, the fact that there is civil fragmentation usually during armed conflicts. And so disinformation has really become a method of warfare as it is used strategically and with adversarial aims by or on behalf of a state, what the scholarship has been calling information warfare. Of course, disinformation during armed conflicts is not something new. I mean, we have it since, when war started, disinformation during armed conflicts was there already. But what is actually, I didn't want to skip this. What is changing is the new dangerous potential, I think, of disinformation due to the technology advancement. First of all, fabrication of content has become easy. Everyone now is able to use Photoshop, basically. It has become very difficult, if not impossible, to distinguish fabrications versus reality. For example, for deepfakes, we don't have the technology to actually tell if it's fabricated or not. We can tell if it's not well made, but yeah, we don't have the technology to do that. And then internet and social media allow for large-scale dissemination, of course, so we can reach everywhere, anyone, anywhere in just a matter of seconds. Of course, we have different forms of disinformation also in armed conflicts with different kind of harms. So we can target different audience, use different technologies, and have different objectives and detrimental consequences. And in particular, I've tried to categorize disinformation in armed conflict, looking at the harm that disinformation can cause. And so I distinguish between disinformation that harms combatants, first of all, disinformation that harms civilians, and then disinformation that harms humanitarian organizations, workers, or the humanitarian work of in general. Well, disinformation that harms combatants, this is pretty obvious in the sense that if we consider disinformation as a method of warfare, then it's obvious that combatants are the most obvious target. And so combatants can really find themselves trapped in what has been called as a fog of information that can actually impact significantly the military operations. And an example of this type of disinformation is the deepfake of President Zelensky I was mentioning at the beginning. But disinformation also targets and harms civilians, who are today actually the most common target of disinformation. So disinformation is really involving civilians in the sphere of armed conflicts, which is something that shouldn't normally happen. And here, three different harms can be actually identified, at least. First of all, disinformation that causes retaliatory violence, targeting certain groups, certain individuals, then we can encourage retaliatory violence against such groups or individuals. And in fact, again, looking at the war against Ukraine, in June 2022, in a UN Security Council meeting, some states have actually stated that incitements of hatred to violence against Ukrainians is leading to the commission of international crimes. So this is what I mean with retaliatory violence. And then it can cause also impossibility for civilians to secure their human needs, preventing access to life-sustaining resources like shelter, food, water, medical care, etc., concealing information or giving false information, for example. And this has also happened in the context of the war against Ukraine. For example, Russia has been promoting false treatments for COVID-19. And then a third type of harm, severe mental suffering and poor mental health through the instillment of fear, anguish, terror that can cause PTSD, anxiety, paranoia, depression, all this sort of issues that are really important. And an example here could be, for example, the activities of Russian disinformation that, well, said that basically the West is pushing Ukraine towards a nuclear catastrophe, encouraging the shelling of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. And then disinformation that harms humanitarian organization work and workers. Humanitarian organizations have also become a very popular, frequent target of disinformation. Also here we can distinguish different types of harms, again, retaliatory violence, hindering of operations, but also loss of reputation and standing, both at the international and local level, with repercussions also on civilians whose right to receive humanitarian assistance is violated and whose right to food, water, shelter, etc. can also be violated because of such operations. And an example was already in the introduction, like Russia was really spreading the disinformation that the ACRC was deporting Ukrainians to Russia. And then, for example, also after the shelling of Kiev and other cities removed from the front line at the end of October, it was spread the disinformation that the Ukrainian Red Cross was not operating anymore in Ukraine because it was too dangerous. So, yeah, sure. So how is this information regulated today under international humanitarian law? So we're moving here to the second part of the presentation. Well, contrary to what happens in peacetime, this information is not really the object of specific and systematic regulation in armed conflict. The scholarship has referred to this phenomenon as a sort of relative silence of IHL on the topic. However, we can use some of the provisions of IHL to actually consider prohibited certain forms of disinformation, at least. So, for example, IHL provides a prohibition of acts of perfidy. So disinformation that amounts to an act of perfidy would be prohibited. However, this provision is actually rather narrow. As you can see, the provision is very specific, as it prohibits those acts that invites the confidence of an adversary to lead him to believe that he's entitled to or is obliged to accord protection under the rules of international law applicable in a conflict, with intent to betray that confidence. And then we also need a material result, which is the killing, injuring, or capturing of an adversary. So as you can see, very narrow scope of application of the provision. And then we also have a prohibition to terrorize the civilian population in IHL. And here the provision says that are prohibited those acts or threats of violence, the primary purpose of which is to spread terror among the civilian population. However, also in this case, I think that the scope of application is rather narrow. First of all, because we need an attack or a threat. And here we were having a discussion with Bohrer yesterday on this. Actually, the Tallinn Manual 2.0 seems to interpret the application, the scope of application of this provision in a very narrow sense, in the sense that, for example, the example of a Twitter message, and I'm reading here the Tallinn Manual, sent out in order to cause panic, falsely indicating that a highly contagious and deadly disease is spreading rapidly throughout the population, is neither an attack nor a threat, and consequently does not violate this provision. So in terms of disinformation, we actually need to wonder, so what is, covered by this provision? And then again, I want to underline that the provision talks about primary purpose of spread terror. So for example, if your primary purpose is to get a military advantage, then the fact that you're terrorizing a civilian population doing that is not really something that is lawful, we can say. And then, of course, we have an obligation to treat protected person humanely under IHL. Here, of course, the provision is rather broad and vague, which is good in the sense, in a protective sense. But again, the provision refers to violence and threats. And so, again, here, I think that the scope of application to disinformation is kind of in a gray area, at least. And then additional and stricter limits to disinformation would be imposed if disinformation was to be qualified as a military operation or an attack in the sense of IHL, because in that case, we will have the principle of distinction, principle of proportionality applying. But yeah, again, the principle of distinction applied to military operations. So it's unclear whether disinformation is actually to be included in the definition. And the principle of proportionality applies to attacks. And it seems that at the moment today, most disinformation is not generally considered as an attack, because again, the notion is still very much embedded in the notion of violence, of physical force. So although this information seems to breach IHL principle of distinction and proportionality, and why I'm saying this, because principle of distinction, because we said that, yeah, civilian population is now one of the main targets of disinformation, and proportionality because, well, a disinformation that works well is a disinformation that can convince as many people as possible. So it's really contrary somehow to the principle of proportionality. Still, we don't know if and how these principles apply to disinformation to this day. So, and then we also have some protection against retaliatory violence, but again, the provisions of IHL are really embedded on the definition of attack, so attack against civilians or civilian objects. So again, we're not really sure how much this information can fit into this. Of course, ICL can become relevant when the act becomes a proper inducing or soliciting of an international crime or an incitement to commit genocide, but yeah. And then talking about humanitarian organizations and operations, these are protected by IHL, of course. So the scholarship has actually said that disinformation aimed at hindering and obstructing humanitarian operation is difficult to reconcile with IHL because we have different provisions in customary IHL and AP1 that protect the work of humanitarian organizations. But still, again, it's not very clear how much such rules apply to disinformation. So this is a little bit what we have. So as a consequence, it appears that most these types of disinformation are still to be considered as legitimate ruses of war. In fact, Article 37 of AP1 mentions misinformation, to be actually read as disinformation in this case, as an example of a possible permissible ruse of war. What are ruses of war? They are a permissible method of warfare, according to IHL, both in Ajax and Ajax. And they are acts which are intended to mislead an adversary or to induce him to act recklessly. They infringe no rule of international law, and they are different from perfidious acts because they do not invite the confidence of an adversary with respect to the protection under IHL. So this is really what distinguishes ruses of war from perfidious acts. So we can see again that the provision is so broad and the scope of application also is so broad that actually most types of disinformation could fall under this label. The Tallinn Manual 2.0 on cyber operations actually gives us two examples of legitimate ruses of war that are disinformation. Bogus orders purporting to have been issued by the enemy commander, and psychological warfare activities such as dropping leaflets or making propaganda broadcasts. So I think it's very clear that the severe mental suffering that might be suffered by civilians, for example, is not really considered as a relevant injury. So basically what we have, I think, is a patchwork set of protections from IHL, but also, even if we don't have the time to dive into them, ICL and international human rights law, that may be used to limit to a certain extent disinformation in our conflicts. Still, the framework has a lot of gaps and ambiguities, and most types of disinformation are today still permissible under the label of ruses of war. And why is that? Because IHL rules comprises criteria and thresholds that, according to the scholarship, and I really agree with this, sit oddly with the 21st century digital disinformation campaigns, as they are linked again to the definition of attack, violent activity, and physical harm, which we don't always have when disinformations are involved. So I conclude that international humanitarian law is unable to address the humanitarian protection needs that actually arises from disinformation. So I think that the shift in target from combatants to civilians and humanitarian organization, as well as the technological advancement, really raises doubts on the opportunity to continue classifying disinformation as a permissible ruse of war. So what can we do about this? Well, we have one option, which is the one of better protect, bringing certain types of disinformation under the definition of attack, or at least act of violence or threat. And this would trigger, as we've seen, the applicability of all range of different provisions, which would place very clear limits on disinformation. But then again, we will have the question of what is the appropriate threshold to establish to trigger such rules. So when disinformation an attack, basically. So I think it would be important to look at the foreseeable result of a severe harm against civilians or humanitarian organizations / workers, and including here also mental or physical suffering, injury, and of course death. And the severity would be to be assessed on a case-by-case basis, considering scope, duration, etc. And then, of course, we would need a causal link between the attack, disinformation, and the harm produced. So in this way, we wouldn't prohibit disinformation, tout court, but we would regulate its use when the targets are civilians and humanitarian organizations and workers. Also because, yeah, as it has been underlined by the scholarship, posing overly restricted limitation would probably be unrealistic, we can say. And then this is probably more controversial. I think that the peculiar nature of disinformation as of today raises question also to the opportunity of considering disinformation always as a legitimate ruse of war, even when directed against combatants. And why do I say so? For three different reasons. First of all, because certain types of disinformation are extremely difficult, if not impossible, to detect and counteract. And again, the example of deepfakes. Second of all, because I think that certain types of disinformation could be considered as violating a sort of principle of what I've called in the paper of fair fighting or fair play. This is not something that has been really theorized, I think, but I think that if we look at certain norms of IHL and ICL, we see that some acts of treachery are prohibited and even criminalized as a war crime, such as the improper use of white flags, different uniforms, etc., can be read under this light of, you know, having an IHL that also protects this idea of having a fairer war as possible somehow. And then because I think that certain types of disinformation could be causing unnecessary suffering to combatants, specifically in terms of psychological harm, through the spread of, again, of terror, anguish, fear, panic, for example, through the threat of nuclear attacks. And because of the sense of impotency on how to counteract such disinformation, let's say. So I think that, I put it out there, contemporary disinformation might deserve specific regulation also when employed against combatants. Well, in my paper, I also raises the possibility / idea, but still is to be investigated, of establishing an independent international humanitarian fact-checking institution with the task of conducting a fact-checking investigation on what is disinformation. But of course, we know that these types of institutions have not been very popular or unsuccessful. So I don't know. Not sure. So yeah, to wrap up and conclude, my main points are that most types of disinformation are today still very much permissible, and there is a long-standing practice in its use. And so I think it's difficult to even start a discussion on possible legal limits of disinformation. Today, the fight against disinformation is, well, absent. when it's out there is really based on the willingness of states. And this is not enough anymore, I think, due to the technological advancement and really like the preponderance that is having in the warfare of today and possibly, I think, tomorrow. And that international humanitarian law rules are in fact very much inconsistent and at odds with this new scenario that we are witnessing. And so I really believe in the importance and need for the elaboration of clearer regulations of disinformation, especially when civilians and humanitarian organizations are involved. And well, I think that the war against Ukraine can be really seen as a sort of momentum to do this, to really bring the debate forward in academia, and also to ask states to do better on this. Thank you very much. I'll conclude here. Looking forward.
Hi, I'm Bohrer. I'm from Ilan University. I mainly research IHL and international criminal law, both present and past. So you have a certain amount of historical comments. I'll say that I return to the traditional format of making suggestions to improve the paper, and I'll start from the fact that the paper is that's something that need not be improved because the paper is extremely well written.
And that's
it's
and you're done.
Yes. You have a very elegant way of explaining things very shortly and very clearly, and it was a pleasure to read.
Can you tell this to my supervisor, please?
It's recording. It's recording.
I have it on tape.
You want to be her supervisor? That's
Yes, please.
In a committee. How should that?
My only suggestion in this regard is that in part 4, when you're saying sometime it will apply and sometime it will not apply, it will be nice if you put an example each time. You're putting only some of the times, and especially when you want to show that it doesn't apply, you are skipping giving an example. So I think that examples, and I'm certain that you can even find real current examples of that would be really helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Now, substance-wise, right. So you've tried to put me inside place me within a camp, and actually I'm a conflicted person. On the one side, I'm this this is me. I'm this militaristic guy that is unbothered by the bombs of war, and on the other hand, I'm this leftist tree hugger as well. So I'm both. So I'm gonna. This is from the last. So I'm going to give critique to the left and to the right, and I'm not promising to be coherent. I might contradict myself.
Okay.
So I think that in some of your arguments regarding the applicable law, you're selling yourself short. I think that you can make a stronger argument regarding the existing law and the extent that it does prohibit fake news. For example, your interpretation of distinction, I think, is narrow, but I'm not going to say anything about that because that would be to steal from Manuel's comment. You said you're going to say today. You forgot? Okay, sorry. So
I've got a different one today.
So if you look at the definition of distinction, you'll see that the first part does not refer to an operation, only the second part. And therefore, there is a strong argument to be made that actually distinction applies much more broadly in this regard. Regarding terrorizing the civilian population, I think that you are in two aspects. You are adopting a limiting interpretation that does not serve you. First of all, why are you embracing the Tallin's interpretation of a threat? There's no reason to the more logical interpretation. Bohrer said it. Moreover, if you look at Geneva Convention 4, Article 33, the phrasing is more broad, and actually, when they refer in the customary in the ICRC customary book, they actually explicitly say that the phrasing of Geneva Convention 4 is broader than that of Additional Protocol 1, because it simply speaks of all measures of intimidation or of terrorism. But since these are things that I'm either stealing from others or was said yesterday, I'm going to focus on the issue of perfidy and treacherous fighting. Notice that I'm not saying treacherous killing or harming, but treacherous fighting. There's a reason for that. And the reason is that presently there's an assumption like treacherous killing and perfidy are the same, but it doesn't mean that the definition adopted in AP1 for perfidy is actually the customary international law definition for that prohibition. So I know that the elements of crimes did assume that that's the case, but historically it's not wrong. So historically, if you look at crimes that have been defined as perfidy and treacherous fighting, these include crimes that do not fall under the additional Protocol 1 definition. Mm-hmm. The clearest example is fighting while wearing the enemy's uniform, which there's no protection here. Another example is the war crime that some still hold. The prohibition that some still hold is a war crime of assassination, meaning paying a person on the other side to kill a commander on the other side. The act that some still think is a war crime of violation of truce or a ceasefire. Truth. Sorry, that's my dyslexia, sorry. Sorry. Yeah. The nice one is and completely forgotten one is throwing an individual enemy. It's completely misunderstood, still found in some manuals. It's actually falsely accusing a person on the other side for a war crime.
Could you explain number 4 again? Sorry? That's what...
Declaring a person on the other side an outlaw.
Okay.
Now, it is presently wrongly understood as simply saying that you deny that person quota. But actually, the historical implication of that crime was that you declared that person a war criminal, even though that person was not a war criminal. No, you accused false accusation.
Okay.
It was false accusation in a war crime.
Well, and as a consequence, the person
entitled
to POW status,
and therefore you can execute them on site.
Can I ask you something before
you? Yeah.
You're saying that there is a historical context that was kind of forgotten by AP1, but assuming that we accepted AP1, didn't we also by that kind of like neglected or?
So Dinstein is arguing no. Dinstein is arguing that the wider definition still exists, and his proof is the existence of some of these crimes. Like the first two are relatively supported. Violation of ceasefire. The prosecutor of the ICC needed to do a lot of song and dance in order to avoid saying if it's still a war crime or not. Outlawing an enemy, I think the only manual that still includes it is the Swiss and New Zealand, but others have forgotten it. You have others that still exist, and that you showed the ones with the flags. Killing a parliamentary, it's a customary war crime, and there's no reason. The parliamentary is a combatant from the other side coming to negotiate. There's no reason to give them protection other than some coordination. And there's a reason. The origin of perfidy is a belief that existed in late medieval ages and early modern time that these biblical proverbs apply in battle. And therefore, there are stuff that shouldn't be done in fighting. There are simply, what you call it, fair play or good faith. That's the idea. That's the original rationale behind perfidy, and this is why you have still these prohibitions that originate from that original rationale of perfidy, and therefore when you say that in the end regarding arguably certain this information could be considered violating a principle of fair fighting, and this underlying principle hasn't been developed. That's actually the original principle of perfidy. So to argue that principle still applies to some extent in current IHL, and to build on that would be a nice argument to add to the paper. And you can rely, for example, on the ICRC book. So that's my lefty side. My lefty side. Now to my militaristic side.
Waiting for it.
So this paragraph saying that it's unnecessary suffering for combatants, it's simply, it's going too far. Soldiers the aim is to make the soldiers of the other side suffer. You want them to suffer, and even from an IHL perspective, it's better that they'll suffer and not die. If it's psychological suffering from misinformation, it is generally preferable to die in battle. So if it would shorten the battle, I think that it's preferable.
But we can say it wholeheartedly because we don't like we outlawed torture. So if it amounts to torture.
No, but come on, it's psychological misinformation. The idea is to make them be less motivated to fight and so on.
Similar to torture,
yeah, but it's weak. I think. Now, here, when in this paragraph, when you are saying that the permissive attitude regarding rules of war is a matter of bygone era, and so on, you touched a personal nerve because there's something that I'm really sensitive to, and that is novelty bolstering. There's a tendency in our discourse to think that things are more novel than they truly are. I'll go to the last paragraph and there's a name to that phenomena. It's called temporocentrism. I knew that there would be a lot of Polish people in the crowd, so
well done.
He was a member of the Polish representation to the UN.
A scholar?
Yeah. In cultural and something. In the 80s.
A bygone era too.
Long gone.
And it's a tendency to think that our period is the culmination of the development from the past, and to think that the crises of our time are for some reason much more drastic than those of other time. And there are two areas in which temporocentrism is the strongest, and that is war or crisis in general and technology. And you are you're pushing both buttons, and moreover, there's also a historical tendency in IHL for an aversion from new technology, to the extent that in the late 18th century, early 19th century, there was even an argument that the implementation of new weapons into war is by in and of itself a war crime. I can bring you a source with Lieber saying that that was the argument.
It's brilliant. I can really use it.
Lieber is making fun of the earlier scholars that said that argument. So you are using two very popular kinds of button. You are pressing two very popular kinds of button, but they are a bit misguided. Okay. I think it's better to say that there are innovation, there are development. Say that at a certain point the quantity makes quantity, but a bit to tone it down, because otherwise it's an exaggeration. Which brings me to the specific issue. So 100 years ago, that was exactly the argument. There was a new technology, two actually, radios and airplanes. And they were both used for propaganda. Moreover, there was a change in the perception of war from a fight between only the warring forces to a fight between nations. And therefore, a main purpose was to break the support of the nation in the army in order for them to pressure the army to stop fighting. Now, if you look at sources, they are saying propaganda, while it always used it's suddenly being used to the extent that it's a new phenomena due to the technology and the direction on the population. Sounds familiar?
Yes. Weirdly enough.
So you can find texts from 100 years ago that make the argument. And the next step, of course, was to argue that it is a war crime. And this did the Austrian. Now, when they are saying it's a crime against state, it's a wrong translation. It's a crime lèse majesté. meaning treacherous, crime, meaning perfidy. So what they are actually saying here is that we caught these two British pirates and we are going to put them on trial for committing a perfidious war crime because they spread leaflets. Now, after the British threatened reprisal, the German pressured the Austrian to pull back. Now, the funny thing is that the British made the same argument on their side, or at least some people on their side. Each side was using propaganda while accusing the other side that their use of propaganda is perfidious war crime. Now, this was the background under which two prohibitions of international law were adopted. One is terrorizing the civilian population. And if you look at the sources from World War I, they are limiting to attack that causes harm because they didn't want to extend it to propaganda. And the other is the one found in Article 21 of the Hague Rules of Air Warfare that explicitly stated that it's not illegal, that it's not a war crime, not only to spread leaflets, but to use propaganda, to disseminate propaganda. And you can see from the interpretation of the time that the reference to dissemination of propaganda in the article would include distribution of news, etc., by radio. So when I'm communicating in the internet through a satellite, which is a kind of an aircraft, it's rather similar. So a strong you are lucky that there aren't many geeks like me that know that history. But a strong argument can be made that the fact that it's not regulated by IHL is not because it's a lacuna, but it's because it was decided that it's permitted.
No, yeah, I agree with this.
So now before it would be understood that I'm making a too strong an argument. I think that a more subtle argument can say that there was always an undercurrent arguing that it is perfidy. And now when the intensity is so strong, it's time for that undercurrent to become decurrent. And that I think would be an argument that would be more based on the history of the relevant norms.
Okay. Ziv is not the chair.
Manu is the chair.
Manu is definitely not the chair. But we are going to take questions, remarks, comments. I haven't decided yet if I'm going to abuse my right to be the first. I will do it. Just to give you a second to decide if you want to ask a question other than Eden, which I already saw, and Robert, and Och. Okay.
Decide how to say your name.
Just use our phone system like that.
That's the UN version. So I am gonna follow a little bit on Ziv's last point, although I have not even nearly enough understanding of the historical development of international humanitarian law, but I have been doing involved with my share of cyber research and technological research, and every time a researcher has come with the idea of a cyber research, my first two questions were, why is it cyber unique? What is unique here that we need to address it differently? And why is it new? And for the most of it, the researcher will start mumble and then trying to think of an answer, but usually it would turn down to either the reach and the magnitude of that and the impact that it can make. Now, in the case of disinformation, one could also make the case that, I don't know, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, when media was much more concentrated, the ability to make that impact was even stronger back then than today when you have so many sources available to you to get information. And if Twitter says something, one thing, and it doesn't appear on a different place, it might not have the same impact, either on the civilians or on the combatants. Which you're talking about examples. The one example that I have in mind for such a impact was, are you familiar with the War of the Worlds? That how do you call that?
The radio show.
The radio show. Yeah, in the UK, the War of the Worlds is a radio show which is based on the booth. Aliens are taking control over Earth, and it was broadcasted in the UK.
Okay.
And even though they were warning, this is just a show, this is just like a podcast, basically, people really got alarmed that what is the
aliens are coming.
Yeah.
and all that
switching on, and you hear about aliens.
Exactly.
and everything, all the security services were really crashed because people were turning to them what to do.
Oh my God. Okay.
So nothing to do with
But only Orson Welles reading T.H. Wells can do that.
yeah, but the idea is that the impact was already there. So I'm not sure that necessarily the impact is new. The ability to reach a wider audience again, but usually you would go for quite concentrated, targeted audience with that impact. So just the same. With regard to damage to combatants, I'm not really agree with Zev that this is the purpose of a conflict, and we don't necessarily prefer them unsuffered than that, because we have some specific restrictions on the use of means and methods of weapons that might get them killed but not injured or permanently blinded lasers. The example we all love to give is a weird example of IHL, but it does exist. And so psychological damage, I think, would be considered as a secondary line of damage to the combatants, and I'm not sure that IHL refers to that to begin with. So there is a question there about where do we stand on both sides of that question. And two last comments is one about the fact-finding institution. Of course, it's always dangerous, and then recent example would be Elon Musk, who said that everything is true will be available on Twitter. Then who makes the decision what is true, what is not, how you do actually fact check everything within our conflict, within all the chaos and everything. So that's apart from who's making the decision, it's what are the actual facts. And lastly, something that came up and I started thinking about while you were talking, which hearing it for the second time actually helped me clearing some of the thoughts. No, it's good because we cleared out some of the obvious comments, and then we're talking about the interesting stuff. Let the people in Jerusalem do the obvious. I'm interested about, you're talking about sending disinformation. I'm interested in what I thought about was the misuse of information as a tool of warfare. And an example of that would be hacking into medical records and threatening to spread them around as a tool of warfare, doing it for the purposes within. I don't know where I'm going with that, just the thought that came through, so the idea of the misuse of information rather than the spreading of disinformation.
Yeah.
Can say you're added to this.
Thank you. I need to remember what you said because my points are exactly on that. So
it's a follow-up?
Completely. That's why I lost my shyness. But finish first your list. You were
that was then. So this is not a baked idea, just a thought that I had during that thing.
Sure.
So if you have
Thank you. Thank you very much.
First of all, super presentation. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm not, I don't have a legal background except for my mom is a lawyer and I have way too
Legal
much
DNA, that's
contact.
something.
I have way too much contact with my tax accountant keeping me out of jail.
Okay.
That's my
That's good.
that's my legal background. So I'm feeling a little bit shy about my questions, but you gave me courage here. Bear with me. Here's what I was thinking. Okay, when you were going over the types of disinformation.
Yes.
Okay. The question that was on my mind was of ownership. Okay. The types of information or disinformation that you were talking about, or if my memory serves me right, seemed to imply, suggest, probably unintentionally, that there is no kind of maybe ownership, or that information per se is some kind of ephemeral concept, like a commons, okay, something like that. So we take information, we interpret it, we can do with it whatever the heck we want. But what about? And I would not use. What did you use? What did you say?
Misuse of information.
Okay, so I'm not sure if I would use the term misuse of information, or rather suggest thinking about it. Okay, as he said, I also just half-baked.
Yeah, sure.
Suggesting widening the concept of disinformation. The example being the following: if we do think about ownership of information, okay,
yeah,
and you, through, for instance, the jamming of satellites, withhold information that is strategically important in a war context, and that a country, say Ukraine, has ownership over, because it's their satellites, or they have rights to it, they have bought it commercially, whatever, okay? Could that withholding of information be interpreted as disinformation, or other similar acts, such as warping satellite imagery, okay? I wrote some other example, I don't even remember. But you know, there are lots of examples where the ownership kind of, I would feel, is established.
Yeah.
And you create this information by warping the information.
Yeah.
And if you were to include that as a type of disinformation, I wonder what your conclusions would be in terms of, there was one slide where you said the causal link has not been established or is not straightforward, okay? What happens to the causal link if you widen the interpretation or the definition of this information, okay? So that is on that point, and then I just had one more question. So a little bit a different point now. You said that in Article 37 uses misinformation, and I'm just curious, is that an oversight, do you think? Or do they do it intentionally? Because misinformation and disinformation are two different things, right?
Yeah, no, I think it's just because then the provision actually makes it clear that it's disinformation in the sense that it refers to the deliberate intentionality of the act. So I think it was just not maybe that clear, the distinction terminologically, because maybe, I don't know, we just reflect on this differentiation more today than, I don't know. But it's clear it's quite clear from the provision that it's disinformation, because there's this intentionality behind.
So they mean disinformation, they just
used
misinformation.
Okay.
That's it.
Yes. So I have a few comments. One of them would be one of the bad comments that tells you to do something different than IHL, so I'll keep it to the last. First off, I have a similar comment to what Ziva said about the telemanual. You buy too much into it and use it, although you say it's not, it's commentary and it's not binding, whatever. But I think you can really criticize it and come up explaining why you think that it's wrong and why it should be altered to that. So that first, regarding psychological harms, Eliav Liblich wrote a paper about trying to assert that psychological harm is also part of the greater harm that should be. So maybe you can look into it and find if it is helpful or not. And Eliav Liblich, he was also at the conference in Jerusalem the first day.
And Manu wrote about it.
Sorry.
But Robert doesn't like what I wrote. So
no,
maybe
but I feel we disagree. It's not always on the same side.
And then I had a thought while you were talking about the whole idea of threats that are being used through deepfake and all that. So I thought that it could. So okay, if there is a deepfake of a threat of, let's say, Putin that says that he would use nuclear weapon, whatever, and let's imagine before the war had started, okay? And then Ukraine, on the basis of that information, starts an attack of a self-defense attack, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, it would be, it would be righteous because it felt that it was threatened, the threat was immediate, whatever.
Yeah.
Self-defense. Yeah. But it was a deep fake, leading to a violation of the UN Charter. So I think there is an idea that could kind of like trigger like a conversation or something to explain the harms that misinformation, deep fake could lead into. So like starting a war on a basis of something that is false. So that's like the beside the IHM idea. Yeah. But other than that, I thought it was really interesting. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
First of all,
you skipped the.
First of all, I was so impressed by the presentation and the response. In the response, it was only the picture.
A picture.
Not in the art. But okay, so besides that, it's a very good and very clear presentation. My only question, I don't know if it's a comment with whether it was correct to look at this issue only from IHL perspective, because I think that many of the issues that you raised that may be problematic could or should be dealt in a different framework, because IHL does not replace all international law norms once there is an armed conflict. There are issues that, and there's a reason for that, why I'm keeping IHL just trying. Maybe there's a good reason to expand some norms and update them, but there is also a price. For example, if you consider more disinformation campaigns as attacks, or one of the options that would put more people that conduct that under the possibility of being attacked. Okay, DPHing, for example. So you're doing it's a tricky side, it's a tricky issue on both sides. If you expand the IHL limits, you put things in a way that you endanger IHL and the people it comes to protect. Let's put aside the issues that states will not take responsibility, which is kind of, we know it a lot from cyber. States don't take responsibility, and at the end of it, there's a person that you can point maybe on it. So it's that's my only comment. Maybe it's another chapter, or I don't know, to look at it from another perspective, or other norms that maybe this is why they made Tallinn 2, because Tallinn 1 was not enough to regulate cyber. It's only.
Yeah, no, I'm totally, I totally agree with you on this. It was a deliberate choice to focus only on IHL, because otherwise I would have figured that it would have become another PhD thesis, which I don't want, and my supervisor would kill me for that. Oh, you don't know him because he's a criminal lawyer. So it's not very much involved. So yeah, no, I definitely know that it was really like cutting, something artificial out of a picture that is much broader, that I know, but it will probably be interesting to actually, kind of be involved with at least some of the non-IHL rules.
Chris mentioned it in the article.
I think that it needs to be a sentence, that you are aware that there's additional regulation by human rights. And
I made some reference to ICL just because, I'm familiar with that, but
simply a sentence.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it would lose the focus of the paper. But
Yeah.
all those other part of the comment is something that you need to deal with.
The part of the picture.
Yeah.
No, the one that extends the target.
Yeah, no, that's
It creates greater risk to civilians,
Yeah,
casualties and all this.
Most
yeah,
of the
I'm
people
not sure
who do
how
that are not necessarily governmental,
But wait, but
That's a point
is
also I
she,
wanted to make about attribution. It's hard to make.
but I'm just thinking, is it an immediate step? Yes.
If it's an attack.
No, I'm saying, yeah, exactly.
If you
Yeah.
put it otherwise, I don't know, if it's an attack, so yeah.
Yeah, no, the moment,
That's what timing does. It says the computer programmer, once what the action that they do is constitute an attack, they can be targeted.
Yeah.
So,
Even in IAC though?
yeah.
yes, the deviation.
You can defeat it. No matter what, it doesn't matter what.
Yeah, me, if I start doing dissemination and we say that amounts to an attack, then I'm deviating.
You should be.
If you can do it in the context, with
Exactly,
the purpose,
yeah, of
with
this-
the intention
of
to
the original.
contribute and to harm the who's part of the conflict.
Right, okay, so you're saying you need the additional
Exactly.
connection.
Yeah.
Yes,
Well,
yeah,
you're
yes,
in
yes.
And just like,
Access
because if you
Yeah.
just do this to just cause harm,
Yeah.
you're not
No,
deviating. You
right.
need to be part of this like whole endeavor.
The additional connections.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks for your presentation and very enlightening response as well. That's history in it. I'll start with following up on what Ziv already did. I made this comment during the conference, and since then I had a time to also look at Thailand too. And Ziv already indicated, like, well, they link it to attack, but that's not actually really how it was meant. But it still also really says the threat. And if there's anything that kind of this disinformation, misinformation can be, it's this threat thing. So I think that is really still something to develop more, because that's the whole kind of option that may be one of the reasons that you use it. In addition, I already mentioned it yesterday, but yeah, the text here, I do think it's very relevant to go to look into Article 33 GC4. So collective penalty, and likewise all measures of intimidation, and it's also, of course, can very much be a form of intimidation or of terrorism activity. So to look into that a bit, the new ICRC commentary won't be available yet by the time you will want to get this out, but the old commentary looks into it a bit. So already explained the various versions and origins of perfidy. You talk about fair play towards the end. There's the principle, according to some scholars, my supervisor, Terry Gill, for example, on the principle of chivalry, being one of the principles. Chivalry normally, then, it's kind of the newer interpretation of perfidy. It focuses on the opposing armed forces. But you will want to have it broader. That's, I think, why you talk about a broader thing like the fair play. But especially because you're talking about it broader, it's interesting to think about who is the object of, and then using attack. Because Minerva says, correct, but military manuals generally, there's a good number of them, which include a sentence saying military operations, not just attack. Military operations are only to be directed at military objectives. And an operation is not necessarily an attack. That's a lot broader. On this specific point, there's a couple interesting amicus briefs, the Nataganda appeal by Eric Jens and Josh Korn and Sean Watts that specifically try to explain, like, well, this is operations, this is attack. There's also one by Alma, but
Who wrote that?
so that's something to maybe consider. And whilst listening to Ziv, I was thinking like, so that they weren't happy about the misinformation during during World War I, but then afterwards they clearly wanted to allow it because it can be a useful tactic. But then what seems to be the case is that it's very much about purpose. If you use this information to be able to gain a military advantage without necessarily harming persons, then it's just, it's useful. But it may allow you to imagine after COVID, you create disinformation, what makes everyone believe that they have to stay inside because there's a disease out there. And then at night you can easily go and no one will see you because you can carry out your operation and end up right in front of the opposing armed forces. But if there is any kind of purpose, if the purpose is to cause harm to civilians, then of course you're already terrorizing, even if you're not, even if it still wouldn't qualify as an attack. And then I was thinking of a good example, and I could only think of like the thing that the Native Americans would do when they wanted to catch a lot of bison, like scare them off on one point and then run them off a cliff. And then it would fall down, and then they could collect them afterwards. If you pretend something really problematic is happening here to scare off the civilians and for them to really cause harm to them because they would run into the fire zone or whatever, then the purpose is clearly to cause harm. Or something like that, or these end of the war movies where they immediately start plundering. That's the first thing that always happens in the end of the war movies. You send disinformation that causes this, so there's damage as a result. Then it's all about just what was the purpose of the disinformation to be sent. Was it kind of really as a ruse of war or something that would cause any harm to the civilian population?
Yeah, I wonder, there's a third category, and that's the category that we were arguing in World War I, and that is to reduce the support of the population, the political support of the population in the war.
But this is what they, after World War II, of course, said that the civilian population cannot be the target of that the enemy had to be separated for the army from so Dresden, the bombardments in Dresden were still considered lawful, but not anymore after the Second World War because they wanted to separate.
But propaganda remained as legitimate. That's
but then there's a difference between what is propaganda and what is, of course. But I know, but that this is. One thing also that wasn't you referred to it, but if you look at the now the conflict in Ukraine. You say there's 5,800 or something instances. For something to really be regulated by IHL, there needs to still be it needs to actually fall either under the personal scope if it's an individual person or otherwise geographical material. So that there might be just a lot which has nothing to do with IHL. Sure. And there may be no belligerent nexus of someone who just does this because a Russian person who doesn't like Ukrainians, a Ukrainian person who doesn't like Russians, or someone who has nothing to do with either two countries, but just somehow wants to get involved with the war. And you probably need to find some way to kind of take away everything that cannot be somehow attributed to either one of the parties of the conflict or someone who otherwise is covered by IHL, because otherwise it's just not, doesn't fall under it. Which is not easy because it's a whole problem, but of course, attribution is cyber.
Yes,
thank you for your presentation, Diletta. I just had a very brief question. Maybe I didn't understand it correctly, but the point regarding the fact that sometimes some types of misinformation are too complicated for the adversary party to catch. I don't know. I feel like at the end of the day, if wars were perfectly symmetric, they would last forever. So a certain level of asymmetry between the forces is somehow necessary and connaturato. Well, it's part of warfare in itself.
No, what I meant was more like that there are some types of disinformation that by their own nature, like deep fakes, you cannot really say for sure this is real, this is being fabricated, you know. And like technologically, I mean, of course you can see, like, for example, a deep fake of Zelensky was very badly made, so you could see that it wasn't natural. Like you could say, okay, this is a deep fake, but the problem is that technology is going very far, so we don't have technologically now like an app or something that runs the deep fake and says, oh, this is being fabricated and this is the true person saying something. So it's not about asymmetric or symmetrical warfare. It's more like that it's practically impossible right now to actually distinguish.
It's also a matter of evaluation of whether or not it's a fake news that is being produced.
It was mainly a way that there's nothing you can do. I mean, it's not like a missile that somehow you can, you know, detect and counter out. It's just something that arrives and you're not even sure what you're getting because you don't have a way to, you know.
But then again, internet, like AI will develop and possibly in the future there will be a way, because of course missiles, there was a time where they were
sure. I'm just saying that right now, this is not something that we have, and I'm wondering if this. I mean, I don't have a strong answer on this. I think I just found it an interesting feature, you know. Yeah, something to think about. I think that somehow made deepfakes and some type of disinformation different from what we know, but maybe I'm again making it more novel than actually.
No, in a way, probably yes, because in my knowledge, but then Ziv can correct me any moment. There's always a moment where there is a technological development that
like hypersonic missiles.
Like or submarines back then. First submarines got possibly, maybe.
No, I
like
get what
you
mean.
Some forces have always been more advanced than others.
No, sure. But here it's not a matter of being advanced, it's just a matter of the nature of the weapon.
Okay.
You know?
Okay.
Yeah, this is something that I found intriguing, but about the legal consequences.
I can just follow up like with the example, maybe just the example of where you can cite under the phrase on human rights should be also examined. That at the Swansea University now there is a true project that is actually, you know, about it. So, and they will probably do the fake thing. Okay.
I have 3 comments. First one is about the difference between disinformation and misleading. I wrote something about the referendum process, peace process in Colombia. And I understand disinformation is when you make the fake news. And misleading is the true facts, but questionable interpretation. And I think it's very different because you, I don't know, touch the freedom of speech. And it is a one issue. On the other hand, it's about Daniak and what happened with that kind of method of war, because in Colombian case it has been no violent mean to attack non-state armed groups. In fact, with the campaigns, some combatants has the mobilization for that way. Maybe regarding your comment, it depends the proposal. With that sense, the first question you said, if misinformation is a method of war, social media companies or newspapers are a military target, because in Colombia it has been a regular way to make the war. You know, the newspapers information or misinformation.
So I would say no to this last question, in the sense that, I mean, going back to discussion that we had already like yesterday and that we were kind of hinting at also today, like this information would become relevant for IHL if it's at least state-based, like promoted and, you know, kind of, but yeah. And yeah, no, I wouldn't go that far in saying that then social media companies become a target. I would be very uncomfortable with that, I guess. I think.
They have the responsibility to make sure that.
Yeah.
It's where you stop
we have cases.
Yeah, yeah, sure.
There is there are proceedings now in the US. It's called Gonzalez versus Google.
I know a lawyer involved in the case.
So again, the social media, it's about them making recommendation and spreading. They're not just the billboards. That's the argument. They are actually having an active part in spreading this. In that case, was ISIS, movies in YouTube, or not just billboard. That's where I think it's come. But I disagree. I'm not.
No, but I think also like the source that creates this information, whether or not you have the NATO attack on the radio station. So it's also kind of alluding to the question of whether propaganda constitutes something like an act that could be, so like could create this military object.
Yeah.
I was going opposite. Which is elegant. You are saying take the NATO president to conclude that they are a military target, and therefore what they are doing is an attack.
Yes, but NATO was very clear to say that the attack was because they also used the radio station to provide, rather than that.
The prosecutor report.
Having said that, of course, the Iraqi Minister of Information, who was giving a press conference, and that very moment they had like missiles land on the roof in order to show that for all the Iraqi citizens that they could reach him at that very moment, was of course more like an attack on propaganda.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Diletta.
No, thank you.